Hey, let's look at Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy today. Second slide, you notice I have an outline of Exodus. And the story of Exodus, and I'm looking at the third slide here, it covers the Israelites and their troubles in Egypt, but there's not a lot of historical moorings for Exodus. We don't know a lot of things. There's some historicity there, but we can't say for certain the archaeological evidence, outside sources from the Bible, records, what have you, that it actually happened. I'd like to think it happened, but it's a faith thing for me. I don't have data. Durham talks about it, contextual plausibility of the Exodus narrative. There's no specific references to Egyptian figures like the Pharaoh. I mean, it just calls him Pharaoh. It doesn't say Ramses like in the the Charlton Heston movie. It could be anybody. There's a few things that seem to have some historical probability or plausibility. I've got a slide on there, the elements of the book of Exodus that can be proven or plausible. We really don't know. So, for most scholars, they tend to, take it with a grain of salt. We don't know. There probably was a Moses. There probably was some sort of Exodus. Now, some of the details may be a little different, maybe a little trumped up in the book of Exodus, but then again, that's ancient historiography. Ancient historiography, or ancient history in some ways, wasn't so much of the facts and the details as much as it was the gist behind it. So it's something to keep in mind, that there's a difference between our modern notions of history and the ancient notion of history too. And you'll find that a good bit in the Bible, that there's a disconnect. And then when we try to read modern notions of history like a fact-based ... happened this way, this date, this time, exactly like it was, a factual, just give me the facts, ma'am, dragnet type thing, that's not what the Bible does per se. It's a theological work. It says more about God and God's people than it does about the actual date, times, and facts. And there are some historical moorings there. Don't get me wrong there. Okay. Now for Exodus 1, it's interesting that there is a kind of a transition / disconnect going on with Exodus from Genesis. Where we leave off Genesis, the Israelites are in the land of Egypt. There's a sea change. Joseph is come to power. You get to Exodus, and it's almost like he's been forgotten. Exodus 1 does act as a kind of an exposition, a narrative exposition for the book of Exodus. Think of it as like in the movie Iron Man, if you're a comic book movie fan or what have you. Tony Stark has to be kidnapped and forced into a weird situation in order to become Iron Man, in order to be changed. In some ways, this book of Exodus 1 and 2 especially, kind of form that exposition. In Exodus 3, we find in this chapter that Moses is in the land of Midian. He marries into these people, the Midianites. In the book of Numbers, it's kind of interesting because in the book of Numbers, the Midianites are the foes. It's interesting, isn't it? Anyway, Moses encounters this figure, this YHWH, Yahweh, as some try to pronounce it. In Hebrew, you would find those three letters, and you'd find the vowel pointing to the word Adonai. Some scholars pronounce this, some Christian scholars pronounce it Yahweh. Most Jewish scholars, depending on how pious they are, would not pronounce this name. Some Christian scholars don't pronounce this name. It's a sacred name of God, and to pronounce so would be taking God's name in vain. But Moses has this theophany, this encounter with God, this divine encounter with God, a manifestation of God, if you will. And I've got the definition of theophany there on the slide for Exodus 3. But this name, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, in the Hebrew, the YHWH, Yahweh, is a tetragrammaton. It's a sacred name. In fact, a lot of the names, like even the prophets or personal names of different figures in the Bible, have some relation to Yahweh. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Jonathan, I cite in the slide there, have some connections to the name Yahweh. Even if you listen to reggae music, Jah. Jah comes from the Hebrew Bible, and that's a shortened form of Yahweh. And if you notice in a lot of the English translations, you'll find all capitals Lord. The Hebrew word behind that is the tetragrammaton Yahweh, or Adonai, if you're be a pious Jew there. Exodus 14, we find an issue. Is it the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds? Now, I may be burned at the stake for this, but there is something to think about here. There is a bit of a bump in the road, if you will. In the Hebrew, the word for this body of water that is crossed by the Israelites as they leave Egypt and go into this desert, into the Promised Land, is the Hebrew phrase here is Yam Suf, which literally, or Yam Soup, literally is Sea of Reeds or Sea of Reed. It's not Red Sea at all, at all. Now, if you get to the Septuagint, the phrase there does mean Red Sea. The modern notion of Red Sea, that the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, may come from this Septuagint translation, where someone maybe didn't know the name Suf, the word Suf, excuse me, the reed, or there was a different tradition going on that they connected into. So there is a question: did the Israelites really cross this huge body of water known as the Red Sea, or did they cross some sort of fresh water, like Timsah, the Bitter Lakes, the Sea of Reeds, because reeds don't tend to grow in salt water for the most part. But anyway, there's a quote there by Collins where he says, "It should not be viewed as historical memory, but as one of the series of imaginative attempts to give concrete expression to the belief that Yahweh had rescued his people and overthrown the Egyptians." So that's one kind of medium that some scholars, you have some scholars that say, yeah, it's all historical, some scholars that say, no, it's not historical, and there's kind of some in between. And Collins has, I think, a decent in between there, a little more to the skeptical side, but something for you to think about, that there is that bump there that you do need to wrestle with. Now, to Exodus 30, the laws and the covenants, there's two different types of laws essentially we find in the Torah. There's the casuistic, the case law. If you do this, then this will happen. If X, then Y. If you obey your parents, your life will be long upon the earth. That's case law. Apodictic law is absolute. It's no ifs, ands, or buts. Just don't do it. Thou shalt not kill. That's pretty straight up. No ifs, ands, or buts. There's no leeway in there. These types of laws, we find clear examples in the Ten Commandments, and there's a slide listing the Ten Commandments there. The Decalogue, if you will. Deca means 10. And I kind of go through and list these different commandments and different little tidbits about this. Now, one of the things I want you guys to do with your paper is pick through these, the key words and phrases in your passage in Deuteronomy 9. That's going to be Deuteronomy 23, 9 through 25. And I want you to pick through and find little tidbits and nuggets in there like this. Okay. Now, skipping over to the slide for Exodus 32, we find the golden calf motif. Now, if you're familiar with the Charlton Heston movie Ten Commandments, the Israelites, while Moses is on the mountain, the Israelites, they mold this golden calf, and they start worshiping this god. And they came from a context in Egypt where there were these deities. Much of the ancient Near East and even Mediterranean, you had some physical representation of the god, some physical representation of the deity. So it wasn't unusual for them to have a deity to want to worship. Now, this golden calf motif pops up in Exodus 32, but it's also mirrored in 1 Kings 12, where Jeroboam, who divides the kingdom of Israel after Solomon during the reign of Jeroboam, Jeroboam sets up places of worship in Bethel and at Dan, so the people don't go back to Jerusalem where the temple is to worship. So he has his own little self-enclosed land with his own temple religious system, and he sets up these figures to be worshipped, these calves at Bethel and at Dan, and that's referenced in 1 Kings 12. And by the way, 1 Kings 12 and 13 even pop up in the story of Josiah and Kings. So it's kind of this meta structure, if you will, going on here. Now, there is a slide in Exodus 32, 1 through 3 that is from Sarna's commentary, and it's kind of, again, what you guys need to do for your paper, where you pick through key words and phrases and try to flesh those out in light of the literary context and the ancient Near Eastern context. There's one about gold rings there. It talks about the alien gods and so on and so forth. Now, over to Leviticus. One of the key themes in Leviticus is holiness. Now, if you were just to read your Bible, you'd probably get stuck at Leviticus. If you start from the beginning, you get stuck at Leviticus and just quit. My wife, when she took Old Testament intro for Gardner Webb when we were students there, she always reminded me, they lost me at Leviticus. They lost me at Leviticus. Don't be daunted by Leviticus. It's about holiness, being set apart. Some variation of the word holy or holiness appears 152 times in Leviticus. And a key verse there is Leviticus 20:26. You will be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and I have separated you from the other peoples to be mine. Holiness seems to be some sort of notion of being distinct from, being set apart from. And I've got a few little quotes there. Being separate unto or to someone or something. Leviticus sets out rituals and rules to help mortals marred by sin be close to have a vertical relationship with God and a horizontal relationship with humanity. Leviticus 19:18 is a good example of this. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's the horizontal part there. Another thing about Leviticus, there's several types of sacrifices that arise in the narrative of Leviticus that, and this notion of atonement. Atonement, at-one-ment, if you want to define it that way. Atonement appears 45 times in Leviticus. Atonement has a dual meaning, Leviticus, in a sense that there's a notion of covering up, the Kippur notion, Yom Kippur, if you've ever heard of the Jewish holiday, notion of covering up. There's also a notion of to pay a ransom for, deliver a substitute for. A very concrete notion of what needs to be done to right one's wrongs, sin, essentially. One of the key words, by the way, for sin in the Old Testament is a notion of missing the mark, like an archer missing the target, or just kind of missing the goal. The goal set up by God for a people. And atonement is making that right, whether as far as covering up or paying a ransom for or paying a substitute for. The New Testament has a more of an abstract notion. The Old Testament has more of a concrete notion. The notion of a scapegoat. It's a really neat notion. It kind of reminds me of the Geico commercial with a scapegoat. If you watch a lot of TV, you've probably seen it, or even on YouTube. Leviticus chapter 11 deals with ritual purity issues, and there's thing about clean and unclean religious sensibilities. It's not, I've got dirt all over me and I need to take a shower. It's ritual cleanliness. There's a strong debate as to why things are labeled clean and unclean. Some find anthropologist Mary Douglas' thesis about categorization of animals based on whether they deviate from perceived norm is good. For example, the animal with divided hooves that does not chew its cud is unclean. Collins makes an observation. I put this quote in the notes here on the slide. By categorizing things in this manner, they impose a sense of order on experience, and this in turn gives people a sense of security, which is especially attractive in a time of crisis and uncertainty. Yeah, well, I don't know. Leviticus 11 can be summarized, in the summarization there. There's these different animals you can eat as food. There's unclean animals called unclean by contact with certain animals. It's a bunch of ritual purity laws, but it essentially is a way of people setting themselves apart. Like for example, I love liver mush. West North Carolina guy, I like liver mush. Pork is unclean. Shellfish is unclean. The things like that are unclean because of this Puritanization, the schematics of this religious purity. If nothing else, some of it may have set them apart from the other people groups around them, made them different, set apart for God. Another issue may be practical reasons, different diseases that carry along with certain animals, different things like that. We really don't know. But there seems to be something going on with religious cleanliness and purity. Okay. Now Leviticus 18 and 20, I've got a few slides on that. And the first slide, I said check the label of a piece of clothing. If you're not wearing 100% of one material, like 100% cotton or whatever, then you're committing a sin according to Leviticus 19:19. Another issue that's brought up in here, is often cited, is the notion of gay marriage, at least homosexuality. It's important to work through Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus 20:13, which are often cited. Work through them in light of the ancient Near Eastern context, and work through them theologically. I'll let you guys do that yourself. I've provided a few little slides, a few little tidbits here from Milgrom, who has a very good discussion of these issues. Something to take into mind, whether you think it's a sin, whether you think it's right, wrong, what have you. I'll leave that in your court. But I want you guys to think of these passages in light of the ancient context and not so quickly quote them, either pro or con, in any sorts of debate. A lot of times people take Scripture and use it as a bludgeon tool to beat people across the heads without even knowing what it's about. Okay? So some things to think about, and even include a slide in there about Leviticus 18:22, where Milgrom works through that verse, and he works through the Hebrew and ancient Near Eastern context. Again, that's that notion of what you guys should be doing for your paper, working through these passages, picking things apart, and looking at them in light of the ancient context. Okay. Now, some present-day import Leviticus. I think Leviticus is really good. Once you get digging through some of the themes here. Some present-day imports, the otherness of God. God is not your buddy. God is something bigger and better. I mean, simplistically, one could quote VeggieTales and say God is bigger than the boogeyman. He is. But God transcends humanity, but His mercy is available for the penitent. In other words, God transcends us, but He does relate to us. And in Christianity, we find that in the person of Jesus more specifically. But again, remember, Jesus was different than His disciples. He transcended them. Okay. Another issue in Leviticus is this notion of fairness in civil law. A lot of fairness in our civil law is missing. People decry the justice system all the time. Well, it's not fair. Arrest rates for certain people of certain color is more of this or that, what have you. We need fairness in our civil law. And as I mentioned earlier, another issue, the present-day import for Leviticus, is this notion of concreteness of forgiveness. Sin requires a price to be paid, a sacrifice. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German pastor and theologian during World War II and earlier, talked about the notion of cheap grace. In Christianity, a lot of modern-day Christians buy into this notion of cheap grace. Oh, I'll just go sin. It'll be fine. God will forgive me. It's cool. But Bonhoeffer talks about the fact that we shouldn't treat God's grace so flippantly. It should be painful in some ways for us to cause us not to want to sin. I mean, I'm kind of playing high and loose with Bonhoeffer's notion, but Leviticus reminds us in a concrete way that it costs us something. I mean, if in a Christian context, if one looks at the story of Jesus and the cross, it cost somebody something, right? If you're not familiar with that, the story is there. The notion is in the New Testament, the Gospels, especially that Jesus died on a cross for the sins of humanity. He died so that we wouldn't have to pay a price for sin. That's the notion of atonement that one finds in the New Testament and Old Testament. Now for Numbers, a lot of people skip over Numbers. Again, like Leviticus, there's a few things going on here. There's a notion of the priestly code, some issues of tabernacle. The bulk of the journeying in the wilderness that one finds the Israelite story occurs in Exodus. And there's a few things. Now, Numbers 11 and 12, I gave you kind of a few little tidbits there. Again, I'm picking up key passages as we go along here. One of the things in finding Numbers 11 is the notion of manna, this substance. And I put a tidbit in there from Juliana Clausen's article there. Some things to think about on manna. Used to have a professor in college who joked around and said that the manna in the wilderness, which we don't know really what it was, the manna in the wilderness was fried okra. Because it was good the first day. If you try to save it for the next day, it's not good. And the story is in Numbers that the manna wasn't good, and for a second day, you had to throw it out after each day. Now, chapter 12 has a few little issues. And again, we're picking out key notions here in these key passages, like one would do in your paper. Chapter 12 deals with Moses' siblings and their opposition to his wife. And they call her a Cushite. Now, there's some debate whether what a Cushite was or what is defined by a Cushite. Some say she's from Ethiopia, what have you. She was a Midianite. Regardless of how one comes down on what the Cushite means in this passage, Moses' wife was ethnic. She was different. I mean, racism ain't new. Ain't nothing new under the sun, right? She was different. And Moses' siblings didn't like that. But one of the things you find in the Old Testament, even though there's this notion of the people sticking to their own kind, is pretty strong in the Old Testament, there's also these notions of inclusion. Moses' wife was one of those who's different but included. The story of Ruth is a story of someone who's different but included. Rahab, and the story of Joshua, someone who is different, someone who's other, who is included. These stories are pretty important, and Numbers 12, I think, is a good example of that. Now, one of my favorite stories, and my kids think it's kind of an interesting story, Numbers 22, the story of Balaam and a donkey. Balaam's this prophet. He's supposed to go prophesy. He's hired, essentially, to go prophesy against Israel. He's riding this donkey, and the donkey starts talking to him. Come to find out, this donkey sees this angel, this agent of the Lord, who's trying to kill Balaam. Balaam can't see it. But it's an interesting story, and there's a few little tidbits I put in there on the slide for you to look at. Now on to Deuteronomy. Now Deuteronomy, you may find boring as all get out. I actually love it. It's pretty good. Good stuff. The name Deuteronomy itself means second law, and that's the one name that comes from the Septuagint. And it seems to be some sort of retelling or summary of or inclusion of previous things that have gone on in the Torah with a different spin. Like for example, Exodus 18 is recounted in Deuteronomy 1:9 through 18. Deuteronomy 1:9 through 19 through 33 is similar to Numbers 13. Deuteronomy 2:26 to 37 recounts Numbers 21 through 32. Deuteronomy 5:1 through 21 is a version of the Ten Commandments, which is found in Exodus 20. There seems to be some borrowing or retelling. There's a genre in the Second Temple Judaism after, before the time of Jesus and around the time of Jesus, a genre where, they kind of Second Testament, a second story, a retelling of things, where, and it seems to be bounce off this notion of Deuteronomy retells things, summarizes things with a different slant. Now, there are some of the different slants that we see in Deuteronomy. So, this is kind of the main themes. Most of Deuteronomy is framed as the words of the Lord, Yahweh, through Moses, a prophet-like figure. And Moses is called a prophet. In Deuteronomy 18 and 34:10, I actually presented a paper recently at several conferences about Moses' prophet motif in Deuteronomy. In fact, there is a Second Temple document, Ascension of Moses, I believe it is, Assumption of Moses, excuse me, where Moses is called a prophet. Deuteronomy is called a work of prophecy. I should send you the paper if you want to see it. Another thing in Deuteronomy is monotheism. This is a really strong thing in Deuteronomy and in Deuteronomistic history, which seems to be influenced by Deuteronomy.